St. John of the Cross was a major figure of the Counter-Reformation of Spanish mystic, a Roman Catholic saint, a Carmelite friar and a priest who was born at Fontiveros, Old Castile. John of the Cross was a reformer in the Carmelite Order of his time and the movement he helped initiate, along with Saint Teresa of Ávila, eventually lead to the establishment of the Discalced Carmelites, though neither he nor Teresa were alive when the two orders separated. He is also known for his writings. Both his poetry and his studies on the growth of the soul are considered the summit of mystical Spanish literature and one of the peaks of all Spanish literature. He was canonized as a saint in 1726 by Pope Benedict XIII. He is one of the 36 doctors of the Church. Early life and education. He was born Juan de Ypes y Alvarez into a converso family in Fontiveros, near Ávila, a town of around 2,000 people. His father, Gonzalo, was an accountant to richer relatives who were silk merchants. However, when in 1529 he married John's mother, Catalina, who was an orphan of a lower class, Gonzalo was rejected by his family and forced to work with his wife as a weaver. John's father died in 1545, while John was still only around 3 years old. 2 years later, John's older brother Luis died, probably as a result of insufficient nourishment caused by the penury to which John's family had been reduced. After this, John's mother Catalina took John and his surviving brother Francisco, and moved first in 1548 to Arevalo, and then in 1551 to Medina del Campo, where she was able to find work weaving. In Medina, John entered a school for around 160 poor children, usually orphans, receiving a basic education, mainly in Christian doctrine, as well as some food, clothing and lodging. While studying there, he was chosen to serve as acolyte at a nearby monastery of Augustinian nuns. Growing up, John worked at a hospital and studied the humanities at a Jesuit school from 1559 to 1563. The Society of Jesus was a new organization at the time, having been founded only a few years earlier by the Spaniard St. Ignatius of Loyola. In 1563, he entered the Carmelite Order, adopting the name John of St. Matthias. The following year he professed his religious vows as a Carmelite and traveled to Salamanca, where he studied theology and philosophy at the prestigious university there and at the Colegio de San André. Some modern writers claim that this stay would influence all his later writings, as Fray Luis de Leon taught biblical studies at the university. Leon was one of the foremost experts in biblical studies then and had written an important and controversial translation of the Song of Songs into Spanish. Joining the reform of Teresa of Jesus, John was ordained a priest in 1567, and then indicated his intent to join the strict Carthusian order, which appealed to him because of its encouragement of solitary and silent contemplation. A journey from Salamanca to Medina del Campo, probably in September 1567, changed this. In Medina he met the charismatic Carmelite nun Teresa of Jesus. She was in Medina to found the second of her convents for women. She immediately talked to him about her Reformation projects for the order. She was seeking to restore the purity of the Carmelite order by restarting observance of its primitive rule of 1209, observance of which had been relaxed by Pope Eugene IV in 1432. Under this rule, much of the day and night was to be spent in the recitation of the choir offices, study and devotional reading, the celebration of Mass and times of solitude. for the friars' time was to be spent evangelizing the population around the monastery. Total abstinence from meat and lengthy fasting was to be observed from the feast of the Exaltation of the Cross until Easter. There were to be long periods of silence, especially between Compline and Prime. Coarser, shorter habits, more simple than those worn since 1432, were to be worn. They were to follow the injunction against the wearing of shoes. It was from this last observance that the followers of Teresa among the Carmelites were becoming known as discalced, i.e. barefoot, differentiating themselves from the non-reformed friars and nuns. Teresa asked John to delay his entry into the Carthusians and to follow her. Having spent a final year studying in Salamanca in August 1568, John traveled with Teresa from Medina to Valladolid, where Teresa intended to found another monastery of nuns. Having spent some time with Teresa in Valladolid, learning more about this new form of Carmelite life, in October 1568, accompanied by Friar Antonio de Jesus de Heredia, John left Valladolid to found a new monastery for friars, the first for men following Teresa's principles. They were given the use of a derelict house at Arguello, which had been donated to Teresa. On the 28th of November 1568, the monastery was established, and on that same day John changed his name to John of the Cross. Soon after, in June 1570, the friars found the house at Arguello too small, and so moved to the nearby town of Mansera de Abajo. After moving on from this community, John set up a new community at Pastrana, and a community at Alcalá de Henares, which was to be a house of studies for the academic training of the friars. In 1572, he arrived in Ávila, at the invitation of Teresa, who had been appointed prioress of the Monastery of the Incarnation there in 1571. John became the spiritual director and confessor for Teresa and the other 130 nuns there, as well as a wide range of lay people in the city. In 1574, John accompanied Teresa in the foundation of a new monastery in Segovia, returning to Ávila after staying there a week. Beyond this, though, John seems to have remained in Ávila between 1572 and 1577. One day at some point between 1574 and 1577, while praying in the Monastery of the Incarnation in Ávila, in a loft overlooking the sanctuary, John had a vision of the crucified Christ, which led him to create his famous drawing of Christ from above. In 1641, this drawing was placed in a small monstrance and kept in Ávila. This drawing inspired the artist Salvador Dali's 1951 work Christ of St. John of the Cross. The height of Carmelite tensions, the years 1575 to 77, however, saw a great increase in the tensions among the Spanish Carmelite friars over the reforms of Teresa and John. Since 1566, the reforms had been overseen by canonical visitors from the Dominican order, with one appointed to Castile and a second to Andalusia. These visitors had substantial powers. They could move the members of religious communities from house to house and even province to province. They could assist religious superiors in their office, and could depute other superiors from either the Dominicans or Carmelites. In Castile, the visitor was Pedro Fernandez, who prudently balanced the interests of the Discalced Carmelites against those of the friars and nuns who did not desire reform. In Andalusia to the south, however, where the visitor was Francisco Vargas, tensions rose due to his clear preference for the Discalced friars. Vargas asked them to make foundations in various cities, in explicit contradiction of orders from the Carmelite Prior General against their expansion in Andalusia. As a result, a general chapter of the Carmelite Order was convened at Piacenza in Italy in May 1576. Out of concern that events in Spain Spain were getting out of hand, which concluded by ordering the total suppression of the Discalced houses. This measure was not immediately enforced. For one thing, King Philip II of Spain was supportive of some of Teresa's reforms, and so was not immediately willing to grant the necessary permission to enforce this ordinance. Moreover, the Discalced friars also found support from the papal nuncio to King Philip II, Niccolo Ormanetto, Bishop of Padua, who still had ultimate power as nuncio to visit and reform religious orders. When asked by the Discalced friars to intervene, Ormanetto replaced Vargas as visitor of the Carmelites in Andalusia with Geronimo Gracian, a priest from the University of Alcala, who was in fact a Discalced Carmelite friar himself. The nuncio's protection helped John himself avoid problems for a time. In January 1576, John was arrested in Medina del Campo by some Carmelite friars. However, through the nuncio's intervention, John was soon released. When Ormanetto died on the 18th of June 1577, however, John was left without protection, and the friars opposing his reforms gained the upper hand. Imprisonment, writings, torture, death and recognition. On the night of the 2nd of December 1577, a group of Carmelites supposed to reform broke into John's dwelling in Ávila and took him prisoner. John had received an order from some of his superiors opposed to reform, or ordering him to leave Ávila and return to his original house. But John had refused on the basis that his reform work had been approved by the Spanish nuncio, a higher authority than these superiors. The Carmelites therefore took John captive. John was taken from Ávila to the Carmelite monastery in Toledo, at the time the order's most important monastery in Castile, where perhaps 40 friars lived. John was brought before a court of friars, accused of disobeying the ordinances of Piacenza. Despite John's argument that he had not disobeyed the ordinances, he received a punishment of imprisonment. He was jailed in the monastery, where he was kept under a brutal regimen that included public lashing before the community at least weekly, and severe isolation in a tiny stifling cell measuring 10 feet by 6 feet, barely large enough for his body. Except when rarely permitted an oil lamp, he had to stand on a bench to read his breviary by the light through the hole into the adjoining room. He had no change of clothing and a penitential diet of water, bread and scraps of salt fish. During this imprisonment, he composed a great part of his most famous poem Spiritual Canticle, as well as a few shorter poems. The paper was passed to him by the friar who guarded his cell. He managed to escape 9 months later, on the 15th of August 1578, through a small window in a room adjoining his cell, after being nursed back to health, first with Teresa's nuns in Toledo, and then during 6 weeks at the hospital of Santa Cruz. John continued with reform. In October 1578 he joined a meeting at Almodóvar del Campo of the supporters of reform, increasingly known as the Discalced Carmelites. There are in part as a result of the opposition faced from other Carmelites in recent years. They decided to demand from the Pope the formal separation from the rest of the Carmelite Order. At this meeting John was appointed superior of El Calvario, an isolated monastery of around 30 friars in the mountains about 6 miles away from Dahis in Andalusia. During this time he befriended the Nunna de Jesus, superior of the Discalced nuns at Dahis, through his visits every Saturday to the town. While at El Calvario he composed his first version of his commentary on his poem, the Spiritual Canticle, perhaps at the request of the nuns in Dahis. In 1579 he moved to Baeza, a town of around 50,000 people, to serve as rector of a new college, the Colegio de San Basilio, to support the studies of Discalced friars in Andalusia. This opened on the 13th of June 1579. He remained in post there until 1582, spending much of his time as a spiritual director for the friars and townspeople. 1580 was an important year in the resolution of the disputes within the Carmelites. On the 22nd of June, Pope Gregory XIII signed a decree, titled Pia Consideration, which authorized a separation between the calced and discalced Carmelites. The Dominican friar Juan Velázquez de las Cuevas was appointed to carry out the decisions. At the first general chapter of the Discalced Carmelites, in Alcalá de Henares on 3 March 1581, John of the Cross was elected one of the definitors of the community, and wrote a set of constitutions for them. By the time of the provincial chapter at Alcalá in 1581, there were 22 houses, some 300 friars and 200 nuns in the Discalced Carmelites. In November 1581, John was sent by Teresa to help Ana de Jesus in founding a convent in Granada. Arriving in January 1582, she set up a monastery of nuns, while John stayed in the friars' monastery of Los Martires, beside the Alhambra, becoming its prior in March 1582. While here, he learned of the death of Teresa in October of that year. In February 1585, John traveled to Malaga and established a monastery of Discalced nuns there. In May 1585, at the general chapter of the Discalced Carmelites in Lisbon, John was elected provincial vicar of Andalusia, a post which required him to travel frequently, making annual visitations of the houses of friars and nuns in Andalusia. During this time he founded 7 new monasteries in the region, and is estimated to have traveled around 25,000 kilometers. In June 1588, he was elected third councillor to the Vicar General for the Discalced Carmelites, Father Nicolas Doria. To fulfill this role, he had to return to Segovia in Castile, where in this capacity he was also prior of the monastery. After disagreeing in 1590-1 with some of Doria's remodeling of the leadership of the Discalced Carmelite Order, though, John was removed from his post in Segovia and sent by Doria in June 1591 to an isolated monastery in Andalusia called La Peñuela. There he fell ill, and traveled to the monastery at Arbeda for treatment. His condition worsened, however, and he died there on the 14th of December 1591, of erysipelas. Veneration. The morning after John's death, huge numbers of the townspeople of Arbeda entered the monastery to view John's body in the crush. Many were able to take home parts of his habit. He was initially buried at Arbeda, but, at the request of the monastery in Segovia, his body was secretly moved there in 1593. The people of Arbeda, however, unhappy at this change, sent representative to petition the Pope to move the body back to its original resting place. Pope Clement VIII, impressed by the petition, issued a brief on 15 October 1596 ordering the return of the body to Arbeda. Eventually, in a compromise, the superiors of the Discalced Carmelites decided that the monastery at Arbeda would receive one leg and one arm of the corpse from Segovia. A hand and a leg remain visible in a reliquary at the oratory of San Juan de la Cruz in Arbeda, a monastery built in 1627, though connected to the original Discalced monastery in the town founded in 1587. The head and torso was retained by the monastery at Segovia. There they were venerated until 1647, when on orders from Rome designed to prevent the veneration of remains without official approval, the remains were buried in the ground. In the 1930s they were disinterred, and now sit in a side chapel in a marble case above a special altar built in that decade. Proceedings to beatify John began with the gathering of information on his life between 1614 and 1616. Although he was only beatified in 1675 by Pope Clement X, and was canonized by Benedict XIII in 1726. When his feast day was added to the general Roman calendar in 1738, it was assigned to the 24th of November, since his date of death was impeded by the then existing octave of the Feast of the Immaculate Conception. This obstacle was removed in 1955, and in 1969 Pope Paul VI moved it to the Dies Natalis of the saint, the 14th of December. The Church of England commemorates him as a teacher of the faith on the same date. In 1926, he was declared a Doctor of the Church by Pope Pius XI after the definitive consultation of Reginald Garrigou Lagrange O.P., Professor of Philosophy and Theology at the Pontifical University of St. Thomas Aquinas, Angelicum in Rome. Literary works. St. John of the Cross is considered one of the foremost poets in the Spanish language, although his complete poems add up to fewer than 2,500 verses. Two of them, the Spiritual Canticle and the Dark Night of the Soul, are widely considered masterpieces of Spanish poetry, both for the formal stylistic point of view and the rich symbolism and imagery. His theological works often consist of commentaries on these poems. All the works were written between 1578 and his death in 1591, meaning there is great consistency in the views presented in them. The Spiritual Canticle is an eclogue in which the bride searches for the bridegroom, and is anxious at having lost him. Both are filled with joy upon reuniting. It can be seen as a free-form Spanish version of the Song of Songs at a time when translations of the Bible into the vernacular were forbidden. The first 31 stanzas of the poem were composed in 1578 while John was imprisoned in Toledo. It was read after his escape by the nuns at Bise, who made copies of these stanzas. Over the following years, John added some extra stanzas. Today, two versions exist, one with 39 stanzas and one with 40, although with some of the stanzas ordered differently. The first redaction of the commentary on the poem was written in 1584 at the request of Madre Ana de Jesus, when she was prioress of the Discalced Carmelite nuns in Granada. A second redaction, which contains more detail, was written in 1585-6. The Dark Night narrates the journey of the soul from her bodily home to her union with God. It happens during the night, which represents the hardships and difficulties she meets in detachment from the world and reaching the light of the union with the Creator. There are several steps in this night, which are related in successive stanzas. The main idea of the poem can be seen as the painful experience that people endure as they seek to grow in spiritual maturity and union with God. The poem of this title was likely written in 1578 or 1579. In 1584-5, John wrote a commentary on the first two stanzas and first line of the third stanza of the poem. The Ascent of Mount Carmel is a more systematic study of the ascetical endeavor of a soul looking for perfect union, God, and the mystical events happening along the way. Although it begins as a commentary on the poem, The Dark Night, it rapidly drops this format, having commented on the first two stanzas of the poem. Becomes a treatise. It was composed sometime between 1581 and 1585. A four-stanza work, Living Flame of Love, describes a greater intimacy as the soul responds to God's love. It was written in a first redaction at Granada between 1585-6, apparently in 2 weeks, and in a mostly identical second redaction at La Peñuela in 1591. These, together with his Discos de los y Amor and Saint Teresa's writings, are the most important mystical works in Spanish, and have deeply influenced later spiritual writers all around the world. Among these are T.S. Eliot, Thérèse de Lisieux, Edith Stein and Thomas Merton. John has also influenced philosophers, theologians, pacifists and artists. Pope John Paul II wrote his theological dissertation on the mystical theology of St. John of the Cross. editions of his works. His writings were first published in 1618 by Diego de Saloblanca. The numerical divisions in the work, still used by modern editions of the text, were introduced by Saloblanca in order to help make the work more manageable for the reader. This edition does not contain the spiritual canticle, however, and also omits or adapts certain passages, perhaps for fear of falling foul of the Inquisition. The spiritual canticle was first included in the 1630 edition, produced by Fray Geronimo de San Jose at Madrid. This edition was largely followed by later editors, although editions in the 17th and 18th centuries gradually included a few more poems and letters. The first French edition was published in Paris in 1622, and the first Castilian edition in 1627 in Brussels.